Alright guys, so today I'm going to be going over tips and tricks for your FItech fuel injection tank. For this specifically is for 1970 and 1981 Camaro and Firebird, but these tips are good for if you're installing a universal tank and using an inline fuel pump, in-tank fuel pump. So the overall process is pretty much done. The reason why I'm making this video is because the instructions didn't really cover a whole lot of, you get a whole bag of parts that you actually end up not even using. For example, the C-clip, if you ordered FItech's complete tank assembly, they'll give you this C-ring, which in the instructions for a stock tank, requires you to drill out a hole, drill holes for screws, and install the C-ring on the underside. Since we're using a fuel tank that they provided, we're going to just measure like the instructions say, and then you trim off the bracket here. Essentially measure out where the bottom is. So what I did was I measured to the bottom of the tank, figured that's where I want my sock cap to essentially rest on, and then you figure out where the pump is going to be secured, and you just trim it so that way the bracket's not blocking the floor, because the bracket goes a decent length. I also grinded out a second indent so that way I could actually attach both zip ties and not have it sliding around, because in the end your fuel line is going to be supporting most of the weight of your pump if your car takes a bump or whatnot. But you still want to have most of the support coming from the bracket, not just this hose clamp. So things I realized that wasn't really covered in the instructions is they give you two sets of foam gaskets, but both sets are the size 6 bolts versus the 5 bolts for your fuel sender. So I've already installed the fuel sender. It's pretty self-explanatory. The only thing it has you do is for these tanks, there's 2 brackets. So they come, essentially this bracket here is doubled up. So what they have you do is, the first step was really confusing because it says to remove the 2 screws and nuts and discard those. So what they're talking about is when you first get this, you have these 2 screws here, but you also have additional 2 nuts and screws up here that connect this bracket to this one. And this rheostat and these 2 screws are actually screwed into this one. So what you're going to do is you're going to unscrew the rheostat after you remove those 2 nuts, the screws with nuts. Remove the rheostat, slide off the rheostat, and you want to make sure you don't pull on this wire. But you're going to slide the rheostat onto the original bracket, and then kind of going back with what we did with our fuel pump, we're going to take our ruler, stick it in the tank, and you want to make sure that it's straight up and down. You want to make sure it's not at an angle. So when you stick it up straight up and down, depending on what the bottom of your, so right here you can't see it that well, but it's at exactly the bottom of the tank roof is at 8.5 inches. So since we know our tank depth, we're going to divide that by half, and then we're going to just add the plus 1/8 for this one. So this depends on where your tank is mounted, what kind of tank you have, but you want to have it about within 1/8. And the reason being is this rheostat, and there's already it comes with this little bar already installed because the actual fuel sending bar is in a different package. So this bar rotates from the top to the bottom, right? And you have your float on one side. When it reaches the bottom, you want to make sure that it's actually at the bottom, and you want to make sure it isn't hitting the top. So this whole process has you trim it. So you need to be real good at measurements, because if you're off, your tank might not read full, or it might read that you still have fuel left and you might run out of fuel. So you want to be pretty precise on this. So when you first take that bracket and you trim it, right, you're measuring the tank, and your measurement is going to come out to this point. So the 1/2 plus 1/8 of an inch, that's going to be from the top to the pivot point. Now, the other part is you're going to trim this bottom piece. So wherever this rheostat slides on the mounting bracket, you're going to trim off this bottom piece. You're going to make sure that there's not a whole lot, because what you don't want to happen is when you install this fuel pump, it's going to sit, you know, however the sock is positioned, but you don't want that sock getting caught up on any of the mounting brackets, and you also don't want your mounting bracket to get stuck and make it where you can't bolt this down. So it's better to do it since you already have it apart now. So once you make your measurements, you know, measure twice, cut once, then you're going to take your, after you mount your rheostat, take your fuel sender float, right, measure it out. You're going to measure it in comparison to the top like the instructions say, but then you're also going to trim it down here, so you're going to slide it back and forth. Make sure you don't take that rheostat past the reason why it comes with this is the rheostat could go 360, and if it does, it's never going to read right. So without that bar there, you know, you could do that. That bar is there so that way it can't actually go full 360. So whenever you take this nut out and slide that bar out, make sure you don't lose track of where that is. So pull the bar out and immediately slide the next one in the same orientation as the instructions say, because if you screw that up, it'll be real hard to figure out which part of the rheostat you're supposed to be at. All right, so other thing that wasn't covered in the instructions was the vent. So they give you, let me see if I can find it. So the kit comes with this vent. And they don't give you really any information on what to do with it, because it's kind of universal on how tanks work, right? You need to have a vent, because otherwise as you're filling, tank will just pressurize and fuel will pop out as you're filling it, so you're not going to be able to fill it. So the vent needs to be vertical, because there's a ball in here, it's a check valve. So as you're filling it, the ball can move up and gravity will pull it down when there's no more air going. If you flip it upside down, nothing will happen. You can blow air through here and that ball will stay down, preventing air to go through it, so it won't actually vent. So it needs to be vertical. It needs to be higher. It needs to be higher than the actual fill line, because otherwise it won't actually vent. It will just vent through the fill line. And you could get fuel to start coming out when you're filling. And you don't want that. So probably going to mount this inside the trunk space in like the fender well kind of area. We'll see. But they don't really tell you what to do with the pump, because they give you a 3-way vent valve. So since I already have this assembled, also, yeah, they tell you in the instructions, but in case you don't understand what they're saying, you need to cut your tubing 45 degrees, just so that way it doesn't essentially get blocked off if it gets flush with the bottom of it. You don't want that. So this will make sure that your return line is actually not blocked. But make sure you cut this opaque tube from your pump. That needs to be flat, otherwise you're never going to get a seal. Anyways, sorry, tangent. All right, so putting my fuel pump in. Also, these zip ties, you know, are pretty okay to use in fuel tanks. Worked as a mechanic before, and you know, they last a while in fuel tanks. The only thing that I would look at is using small zip ties. All right, let me see if I can orientate this. Okay. So I got some wires stuck there. So depending on, I'm not sure yet on how I'm going to orient my fuel lines, possibly going somewhere over here. But this vent line from your fuel pump is going to make sure that you're getting a vent from here, but you also have a fuel tank vent, right? So this is the best way to do it because you don't want to rely on just this one. So this T is going to go in line kind of like so. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to route tubing from here to here and here to here. And these two, you can technically run these two independently, but you have to have a vent valve for each one of them then. But I'm going to run that combined line up to this, up in the fender well, somewhere above the fill neck when I get it out to the gas tank port. Other things that the instructions doesn't cover is for this one, since it talks about the C-ring and the other one, this one I was kind of confused because at no point do they tell you how to use the long screws. And like I said, they give you a bunch of extra stuff. So if you're not using the C-ring, you don't need to use the long screws. They give you a set of these. I don't know what size it is, probably like 1/2 inch, maybe a little bit smaller. But you have these, and they already have an O-ring gasket. If you were using a C-ring and mounting from the inside, these would be your lock nuts up on the top. The thing that I was confused about is in their video online, when they show the instructions, they show these as these nuts. Which doesn't really work if you don't have anything to thread them into, because obviously you're not using the long screws from the inside. You actually physically can't, because in the supply tank they thread the holes. So unless you drill out these holes, you're never going to get be able to push a bolt through, and it's too small to fit a screwdriver in with your hand. Other than that, pretty much the rest of this is just going to be mounting it. They do come with mounting straps. So since my car is a complete restoration project, I'm going to have to get bolts that'll fit that. But yeah, other thing is it does tell you in the instructions you do need to run power wires to here. It is nice because they supply you with a very nice electrical connector coverings and 2 cable terminals to actually put onto here. So it looks like this center washer that's slightly larger, that's probably something I'm going to be putting on top. The problem is that this is your ground, which means if there's any moisture, and I live on the East Coast right now, if there's any moisture that kind of builds up here, you can easily ground with any moisture from your power terminal to your ground. So that's a problem. So for anybody installing a tank like this, I would recommend when you put your cable on and you put this on, there's a product you can buy, exterior sealant, but you can also buy what they call liquid electrical tape, or you could just try using electrical tape, but I'd probably use liquid electrical tape around the bottom here, so that way you're not getting any possible moisture that if any water pools up on here or splashes up from if you're going driving through a puddle, then nothing splashes up on here and grounds it out, because then you don't want your car to just suddenly die because your same thing here, your power terminal and your ground. So what I'm going to do is cover those up with the rubber boot connectors they come with, but I'm also going to put some electrical sealant on here to make sure there's no current passing through from your power to your ground. I'm going to run a power cable from the ground wire probably to here, and then do a combined ground from this one and route that to my power distribution box that I'm keeping in the trunk. As far as the installation goes, since I'm kind of covering this for all different types of tanks that use this kind of system. I won't go into the specific details, but when you do mount this, you want to make sure that it's firm, because any kind of rattling is going to cause vibration to your sender, which is sensitive. If you're like actually rocking it in a violent manner, it's okay to drive, obviously, over bumps. But if you're rocking it back and forth, that steel bar is pretty much just holding a little ball at the end. And if you're just moving it back and forth, there's a chance that you're going to break that rheostat plastic housing that's holding that in place. So as long as you drive normal, you know, these will be fine, but you want to make sure that this is actually tight so it moves with your car. And then make sure you ground out your tank. If you don't ground out your tank, one, these pumps will never work, because they need to have that power going from your negative end actually going back into the system. And then you also need to make sure that you're grounding it out, because when you fill it, you want to make sure that you open your fuel door, you're not causing any static buildup or whatnot from your system. So, okay, I normally don't make videos, but I figured I'd make this one since I couldn't find a whole lot of information on this. It took a little bit of time to go through the instructions. They're not exactly straightforward, so hopefully it helps. If it does, let me know. If you have any comments, questions, definitely shoot a comment, and I'll probably go into adding more parts to my Firebird soon. So you can always hit subscribe if you're interested. All right, peace out.